April 24th to June 22nd, 1941. Traveling east-northeast into Germany, our train passed through the hometowns of many of the troops in Hamburg and Lübeck without stopping. During the 30-hour trip, only brief halts were made to change the locomotive. Before the journey continued, after traveling roughly 625 miles from Verviers, we finally disembarked at the city of Elbing in East Prussia. From there, our division immediately set out on the first of 2 night marches. When dawn broke, we halted in the woods beside the road for a meal of cold rations, hidden from any air surveillance by the trees above us. We rested on our canvas bedrolls in the warmth of the day before returning to the march as darkness fell. On reaching Heiligenbeil, about 25 miles northeast of Elbing at the end of April, we took up our quarters in barracks. During the next 6 weeks, our training exercises intensified, which only increased speculation regarding our mission. The majority of those around me continued to anticipate that we were going to be part of a military operation somewhere in Scandinavia. Most of us found it very difficult to imagine that Germany would attack Russia. The Russo-German Non-Aggression Pact, signed in August 1939, probably influenced our mindset, but it was also simply the scale of the Soviet Union that tended to make the prospect of invasion difficult to conceive. By this time, war news had grown to be routine and received scant attention. The Afrika Korps in North Africa to assist the Italians in early 1941, as well as Germany's occupation of Yugoslavia and Greece later that spring, elicited only limited interest among those around me. Though I personally attempted to follow the German air assault on Crete at the end of May, such distant developments seemed to be of little direct consequence to us. On June 8th, our division departed on a further series of night marches to another undisclosed destination. The journey ended 3 days later at Labio, about 50 miles northeast of Heiligenbeil. At a concealed site in the woods, we continued to prepare for an unspecified large operation, but now did so covertly. Positioned so close to Soviet-controlled territory in Lithuania, there was increasing suspicion that Russia might be the target after all, though a degree of uncertainty still prevailed. Isolated in the woods, we failed to see the massing of infantry, panzers, and artillery around us that would be necessary for a major operation. With the port of Mainz nearby, it also still appeared possible that we might receive orders to embark on a ship for a voyage across the Baltic Sea for some type of mission in support of Germany's ally, Finland. As far as the timing of any potential operation, we remained completely in the dark. Just after my 21st birthday, on June 17th, orders came down to us that the invasion of Russia was at hand. Almost immediately after receiving the directive to prepare for the attack, we set out from Labio on a long but rapid march to another forested bivouac area in the northeastern corner of East Prussia, at Heidelkrook, a little north of Tilsit. This would place us less than 10 miles from Russian-controlled territory in Lithuania, which the Soviet Red Army had occupied just a year earlier. Perhaps surprisingly, there was no real discussion or debate over this momentous news among the troops around me. Instead, there was almost a sense of relief that our weeks of waiting and uncertainty were over. We now had our orders and we immediately focused on preparing for war. It is also true that, as young men, we possessed little tendency to ponder matters deeply. That may indeed be an essential quality for a soldier. If you ordered a company of middle-aged soldiers into combat, you would probably have a problem getting them to fight without convincing them of the necessity of their action. It was not that we soldiers were unconcerned about what was going to happen, but we were conditioned to obey orders as soldiers in a fighting unit. Though most of the men around me had little or no interest in politics, it was nonetheless apparent to all of us at the time that war between Germany and Russia would be of great historical significance. When German troops, and the public back home learned of the invasion of the USSR. Most reacted with a deep sense of uncertainty, very different from the mood prevailing at the start of the campaign in the West. The questions that circulated reflected these concerns. Why is this attack occurring before we have defeated the British? Are we going to repeat the experience of Napoleon? What will happen next? Few Germans doubted our ultimate triumph, but many wondered about the duration of the struggle and the price of final victory. Almost no one questioned the morality of a crusade to destroy Soviet Bolshevism, but there were some, like me, who shared practical misgivings. Germany's forces were already engaged all over Europe, and it appeared to me that Hitler risked overextending our manpower and resources by undertaking such a colossal campaign in the East. For the large majority of Germans, the war was never about the Nazi dream of conquering Lebensraum, living space in the East for colonization by the Aryan master race. Like most other German soldiers, I was fighting for my fatherland out of a sense of patriotic duty and the belief that Soviet communism posed a grave threat to all of Europe and Western civilization. If we did not destroy the communist menace, it would destroy us. In eliminating this danger to Germany and Europe, we would also be liberating the Soviet peoples from their oppressive communist masters. Though Nazi propaganda presented the Slavic population as Untermensch, subhumans, none of the men around me embraced such extreme racial views. For us, the Slavs were not a biologically inferior race of human beings. They were simply the ignorant inhabitants of an uncivilized and backward country. At the start of the invasion, Germany possessed a large army of veteran troops who maintained supreme confidence in their ability to overcome any enemy. In the wake of our string of earlier victories in Poland, the West, and the Balkans, we could not have been more assured of ourselves. A few lines from a letter I wrote to Annalisa later that summer expressed the personal optimism that I had come to feel. It's tough here and we fight, but we fight for a reason, and I am confident we are going to win. I am positive about that. June 22nd to July 5th, 1941. On Sunday, June 22nd, 1941, the pre-dawn silence was shattered by the roar of guns as 3 million German troops commenced Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union along an 1,800-mile front from the Baltic Sea. The tremendous cascade of thunderous booms echoed around us as German artillery delivered a short but intense hurricane of shells against the Russian lines, producing flashes of light all across the eastern horizon. As dawn broke, the dim sky above us was filled by waves of Luftwaffe and Junkers bombers, Stuka dive bombers, and Messerschmitt fighters droning overhead on their way east. The appearance of this aerial strike force was quickly followed by the rumble of tank engines revving up, but the noise soon faded as the German panzer units raced eastward. The shock of this combined blitzkrieg, lightning war, routed the Red Army forces defending the border and sent them into a full retreat. Late the following morning, the 58th Division received orders to advance as part of the 2nd Echelon of troops in the 33rd Corps of the 18th Army. The 18th Army, 16th Army, and 4th Panzer Group made up Army Group North, one of the 3 massive army groups North, Center, and South created by the Wehrmacht for the invasion. As we crossed the frontier, no border defenses were visible, but we noticed an immediate difference in that roads were not as good, though a few were paved. The next evening, the 154th Regiment staged brief assaults against Soviet positions in the small Lithuanian towns of Pagiralis and Kavadama, located about 25 miles east of our jumping-off point in Heidelkrug. These short actions against what might have been border troops did not even require the support of our heavy weapons, and we were ready to press on the next morning. Advancing about 15 miles a day, we reached Sioliai about 60 miles northeast of Pagiralis by June 28th. Though the panzer units were far ahead, the 58th Division's rapid progress soon placed it in the lead among the infantry divisions of Army Group North. Despite occasional traffic jams, everything was moving swiftly east, boosting our confidence. In the midst of our success, there was growing optimism that we could defeat the Soviet Union by the coming winter or the following spring. Our march pressed on through long summer days that lasted from an early dawn until a late dusk. When our officers ordered a halt, typically establishing our encampment in a field beside the road, following a filling meal, the entire company would seek sheltered positions in which to sleep. If camped in a village, we might sleep behind a home but never inside, knowing that any structure presented a potential target for enemy artillery. Unless posted to guard duty, I would prop my head on my steel helmet and instantly fall asleep. Anywhere from 2 to 4 hours later, someone would wake us with a kick in the rear. Within half an hour, we would eat breakfast and resume our trek, battling both stifling heat and thick clouds of dust. We plodded countless miles there with few breaks from our march, except for the occasional chance to hitch a lift on one of our company's horse-drawn vehicles. After a while, a kind of hypnosis would, minutes under fire, yet after the preliminary anxiety had passed, my composure would return as my mind and training took over. From that time, I controlled my actions, not the enemy. There was a job for me to do, and I was going to do it. July 21st to August 17th, 1941. Following a 2-week pause to regroup on August 8th, the German offensive was resumed in an effort to reach Narva and shut the corridor to the Baltic region. Our 154th Regiment had pushed about 10 miles north of Niso to the junction of the Pliusa and Piata River. At this point, roughly 4 miles south of the Estonian capital, a destroyed bridge across the Pliusa on the main road to Narva halted our advance. Our new assault commenced early on the hot sunny morning of August 14th, with German artillery pounding the Soviet positions across the river. With enemy resistance reduced, infantry from our regiment began crossing the river on rubber rafts about 50 yards to the right of the ruined bridge. Though lacking specific orders in my still sporadic role as forward observer, I decided to tag along with a group of infantry troops heading up to the Pliusa River in order to get into the action. Just as we reached the river, about 9 o'clock that morning, the air around us suddenly filled with the shriek of incoming artillery fire. Reacting instantly, I darted to the left of the blown bridge, seeking cover in one of the many foxholes dug into the riverbank. The entire area was soon inundated with a storm of shells, with some landing as close as a few feet away from my position. It was impossible even to stick my head above ground. There was nothing to do but to press myself into the bottom of the foxhole. When shelling is that heavy and that close, you simply hope the enemy gunners do not manage to land a direct hit that will turn your refuge into a grave. A couple of hours into the barrage, a brief pause in the whistle of incoming shells allowed me to poke my head up to see how the dozen or so men around me had fared in the foxhole. Just a couple of feet to the left of me, I witnessed a bizarre sight. 2nd Lieutenant Monsterman, the commander of one of our company's platoons, sat reading a book as if he were on a park bench, completely oblivious to the shelling. It was apparent to me that he was suffering the effects of shell shock brought on by the intense barrage, but there was nothing I could do for him. To my knowledge, the German army did not even recognize such trauma as a legitimate medical condition that would justify a soldier's removal from combat. My scrutiny of monstermen lasted only seconds before more artillery rounds came screaming into our area, forcing me to retreat back down into my hole. When the shelling finally slowed about 5 hours after it had started, monstermen had disappeared. I decided to cross the Pliusa River in order to seek out my company and obtain new orders. Climbing out of my foxhole, I joined other soldiers who were making a crouched dash to the position about 50 yards to the right of the bridge, where our troops had resumed crossing. squeezing onto an infantry squad's raft. I headed for the opposite shore, perhaps 30 yards away. They were shooting all around us as we gained the far side. Leaving the infantry, I cautiously crept back along the riverbank toward the wrecked bridge and crossed the dirt road to the left-hand side, keeping my new MP-40 submachine gun constantly at the ready, but inaccurate beyond any distance greater than about 50 feet. The fire of the MP-40 resembled that of a shotgun more than a rifle, though it was the standard weapon for a forward observer. I would have preferred to retain my Mauser. Moving forward from the riverbank, I kept to the brush and trees parallel to the road on my right, perhaps 150 yards from the river. An enemy bunker, built of wooden logs, appeared just ahead of me on the edge of the road. The Soviet troops inside were blazing away in the direction of German troops to my rear. While lacking any means to communicate with our company's heavy guns, it was clear to me that our advance would be slowed until the bunker was eliminated. With the attention of the Russians focused on the road, there was a chance for me to destroy the fortification on my own if I could get close enough to use one of the 3 or 4 grenades that I carried. Moving out 20 yards from the road into the brush, I began working my way around to the side of the bunker. Just as I reached a position at a right angle to the structure and started crawling toward it on my belly, the gunner inside must have spied the swaying of the grass to his right as he swung his weapon in my direction. I flattened my body into the ground at the same instant the machine gun began spraying fire that passed only a little above my head and back. Even with my body pressed against the earth, I felt one of the bullets literally rip the fabric of my uniform, expecting to be killed any second. A wave of terror ran through me. All of a sudden, the gunner shifted his weapon back to the road, perhaps believing me already dead. A minute passed with no further fire in my direction. Still lying on the ground, I lifted my head up. The bunker's gun portal was only 10 or 15 yards away. A quick sprint might just give me time to reach a secure location at the side of the fortification, allowing me to toss a hand grenade through the gun portal. Yet even with my adrenaline pumping, my brain told me that I would be cut down before I could obtain a position safely out of the line of fire. Lacking any other options, I began to slide slowly backward, hoping my movement would not draw any further attention from the gunner inside. My stealthy retreat had carried me only a short distance from the bunker when 2 deafening back-to-back booms resounded. Looking up, I watched with amazement as the bunker's logs rose briefly into the air before crashing back to earth in a pile of debris. It seemed almost miraculous. The mysterious source of my salvation was revealed when I saw one of our 75mm howitzers deployed in the middle of the road back near the river. Afterward, one of the gun crew explained that soldiers from my company had managed to bring the gun over the river and haul it up the road by hand. Immediately after the Soviet barrage had ended, spotting the enemy bunker, the gun crew packed extra explosive charges inside the shell casings to increase the velocity of the rounds. At a range of less than 200 yards, the shots simply annihilated the target and may have saved my life. Later that day, I linked up with the rest of my company. With no clear front line, it was very difficult for our heavy weapons company to provide effective support to the infantry. The Russians attempted to counterattack our bridgehead on the north bank of the Plisa for 3 days before pulling back eastward toward Leningrad. Casualties had been high for both sides. Despite the losses, however, we remained optimistic. None of us had expected that the days of easy advances would last. Now, we steeled ourselves for more bloody fighting. August 18th to mid-September 1941. The Plisa River crossing opened the way to Nava. By the time the 58th Division reached the city on August 18th, the fighting had largely ended, enabling us to move eastward down the main highway toward Kyrgyzstan. The next day, another month of often vicious combat with the Red Army lay ahead of us before our campaign would reach its goal, the capture of the area around Narva. This largely sealed the main corridor through which Red Army forces had been retreating from the Baltic states and secured the German rear for a renewed offensive to the east. Moving close to the Baltic Sea coast, our division and the 1st Division would continue to serve as the left flank of Army Group North. Our ultimate objective was the seizure of the metropolis of Leningrad, the former Russian capital, which was second only to Moscow in strategic importance. Despite the threats to our flanks along the highway between Narva and Kingisepp, our regiment made rapid progress and soon came to a fortified line of bunkers and minefields along what had been the Soviet-Estonian border before the previous summer. With our company providing fire support, the regimental infantry quickly smashed through the barrier in a series of sharp, intense engagements. Behind this defensive barrier lay the town of Kingisepp, located about a dozen miles due east of Narva, while the 154th Regiment approached it on the main highway from the west. Other elements of the 58th Division and the 1st Division had advanced from the south and were already engaged in combat in the town. When our regiment arrived, we briefly experienced our first street fighting with Red Army units, though it took place among widely spread houses rather than inside a built-up area. Because our regimental infantry needed direct fire support in its urban combat operations, our company brought its 75mm howitzers to within a few hundred yards of the front, much closer than their normal position, at least half a mile in the rear. Unlike the much heavier 150mm gun, the 75mm howitzer could be maneuvered a short distance by its 5-man gun crew, making it practical for use in urban combat conditions. Yet even these smaller guns were relatively cumbersome and could not move nearly as swiftly as the infantry. While troops could quickly retreat or jump into a foxhole, our guns were very vulnerable out in the open. When the gun crews could directly sight their targets, there was little or no role for either a forward. With relatively limited opportunities for support from our heavy guns, they advanced through a chaos of numerous large and small engagements in which enemy attacks might come from any direction. By the time we finished eliminating the last pockets of Russian resistance on August 20th, we had claimed a town in which many homes were only flattened rubble. Following 3 days of desperate Soviet counterattacks at Kingisepp, our division set out on the final leg of our advance on August 23rd. On reaching the town of Alexander about 6 miles east of Kingisepp, we encountered more determined enemy resistance. The heavy fighting continued over the following days as the Red Army bitterly contested every mile of our push northward. By August 29th, we had finally reached Kotli, roughly 8 miles north of Alexevka, while other elements of the division held Felkota 4 miles further east. On September 1st, we captured Kapari, located at about 9 miles east-northeast of Velkota. From here, it was possible to see the waters of the Gulf of Finland in the distance. 3 days later, we arrived at Nicolia, another 12 miles further east. Another several days of severe clashes followed as we passed through a wooded region. Exiting the forest on September 6th, we reached Yatlati, located another dozen miles east of Nicolia. Though this brought us back onto a main highway, intense Soviet resistance limited our progress to about 3 miles a day over the next week. Each of the 3 regiments of the 58th Infantry Division were assigned different objectives, while the 220th Regiment would move directly down the main highway toward Krasnoye Selo. The 209th Regiment would capture Dudegov a couple of miles to the south, and our regiment would seize Finskaya Korovo and Kamen, located 3 or 4 miles to the northeast. Gaining control of this region by September 14th, our division was now positioned to push into Leningrad, the center of which lay about a dozen miles north. As we advanced in mild fall weather, the Red Army opposition ahead of us appeared to diminish, though enemy shelling continued. On one day, projectiles the size of a small car were visible overhead as they raced through the sky toward our rear with a loud whoosh. A thunderous boom behind us would immediately be followed by the quaking of the earth under our feet. Despite a distance of several miles between our location and the point of impact, a little later we learned that these massive rounds were fired from the battleship Red October, anchored out in the Gulf of Finland. Late in the afternoon of September 15th, our company passed through Uretskeg, which appeared to be just another typical Russian village of small wooden cottages. Only when we reached the shore of the Gulf of Finland did I realize our location, just 7 or 8 miles away from central Leningrad. Its high rises and tall smokestacks stood silhouetted against the horizon. While feeling no sense of euphoria in the midst of combat, we had every expectation that the capture of the city and victory over Russia were within reach. As we moved up the street that ran along the Gulf, Soviet ships were still passing in and out of the harbor on the horizon, apparently oblivious to our presence. Even more oddly, an empty trolley from Leningrad passed down the street, headed in the opposite direction. Later, we heard that the lead elements of our division had actually encountered the streetcar as it carried a group of Russian passengers unaware of the German arrival. Climbing aboard, the troops politely requested the civilians to exit the vehicle for their own safety as they secured the area during a temporary halt. The following day, a group of us examined a number of abandoned Russian artillery pieces which had been positioned on high ground overlooking the Gulf. With Soviet ships continuing to cruise through the waters a couple of miles away, we decided to try our luck firing a long-barreled gun with about a 4-inch diameter muzzle that appeared to have the necessary range. Aligning the barrel by sight in the approximate direction of our selected target, we stuck a round into the chamber and carefully yanked its lanyard. Out in the Gulf, water splashed up in the air beside a freighter without causing any damage. We never succeeded in hitting anything with the half-dozen or so shells we fired, but the experience provided my one chance to claim participation in a naval battle. Resuming the advance soon afterward, we fought our way forward into the streets of Leningrad's suburbs, past blocks of 2- or 3-story wooden buildings, meeting only intermittently stiff resistance from the Red Army. After advancing a mile or two further through the streets, we received orders to halt and pull back from the city into a more defensible position back at Uretskeg. Because of our trust in our high command, we believed that they must have had a good tactical reason for such a decision. Many of us expected that this halt was a temporary measure to allow us to regroup before the resumption of our offensive with a coordinated attack. There was no indication that our effort to capture Leningrad by direct assault was at an end. A few days later, we learned with some frustration that Hitler had ordered a siege of the city rather than an attempt to take it by storm. By this time, the Wehrmacht had completely isolated Leningrad from the remainder of the Soviet Union, except for a water route across Lake Ladoga, so it appeared that its surrender would nonetheless only be a matter of time. While our heavy weapons company of about 300 personnel had lost perhaps 10 to 15 men over the preceding 3 months, the toll of almost daily combat had been far more costly for most of our regular infantry companies. From their initial strength of about 180 troops, they had typically been reduced to a force of between 50 to 75 men. In spite of the tremendous casualties, our high morale and the much worse state of the Red Army at this time left no question in our minds that if given the chance, we could have reached the center of Leningrad within days. In retrospect, it is uncertain whether we possessed adequate strength to capture the city with the available forces, but the failure to even attempt a direct assault would prove to be one of Hitler's greatest mistakes.